If I could ask everyone to have a seat, we're going to start with our program. My name is Jeff Wilmshurst, and as you may gather from looking at me, I'm related to Ron. I'm his oldest son. I'm joined here by my brothers John, where's John? There he is, and Peter, and other members of our family, many of whom you will have a chance to hear from today, and hopefully who you've had a chance to say hello to before we started. I also want to welcome not only all of you who are here in the room, but there are many of us, I'm going to see how many now, about 18 viewers, and that may be more than 18 people, who are viewing this live streamed around the world. So I suspect that we have family in Australia and maybe in Hong Kong. We have family certainly in Nova Scotia and potentially in other parts of the world that we don't know about who are joining us today. And while they can't speak, which is probably a good thing, I want to welcome them as well. So I'm going to look into the camera and thank you for joining us, family and friends from other parts of the world. I hope that you can hear me. Technology's been a little bit tricky today, but we managed, I think, to get it sorted. We'll get the reviews after we're done. But I want to thank certainly all of you who are here in the room today for joining us. My father was obviously very special to us and to his family, but I know that he was also a very special person to many people in this community, and I think that there's a testament to that today by the fact that so many people have come here. There's going to be a number of us say a few words about my father, and because I'm the oldest and I'm a bit of a bully, I'm going to go first. So please bear with me as I say a few words. I have no memory that does not include my father in my life. And so it is a bit disorienting today, as it is for every person who loses a parent, to find myself speaking of him in the past tense. And yet, he is very much present in my life, and he always will be. What one always hopes for as a parent is to be some kind of constant or North Star for one's children. Dad was that person to me. I knew I could count on him, whether it was for advice on finances or simply to know that what to do when things weren't going well. And for those of you who knew my father well, you know that he didn't talk much, but he listened a lot, and he listened well. And because he listened, he had insights into who I was as a person that he could share with me. He also had insights into people around him, especially his tennis partners, which he used to good effect on the courts. So for those of you who play tennis against him, you'll understand maybe why you didn't win very often. My earliest memories of my father were of him sitting in his favorite chair of the moment, reading his paper, and ignoring the cacophony of his family, which somehow he could keep in the background, much to the annoyance of my mother. My other keen memory of him was watching him on the tennis courts or pitching a game on the fastball field. I was always in awe of his natural sporting ability, and I always wished that those genes had been passed on to me. That didn't happen, however. He was generous, however, always encouraging me in what I tried to pursue, even though I suspect it was painful for him to watch me in my sporting activities. Some of his grandchildren, such as my son Jake, who you may have met today, made up for that, however. Dad enjoyed the outdoors, and he was a farm boy at heart. He grew up in the lush Annapolis Valley of Nova Scotia and often talked about his days on the farm fondly. As an adult, he enjoyed our annual camping trips to Kejimkujik National Park in Nova Scotia. Those long driving trips with 3 boys often fighting in the back seat were probably not a treat. My mother yelling and my father trying hard to replicate his Zen-like state at the steering wheel. Dad was cheap. No stops for fast food, always sandwiches, and where possible, no bathroom breaks in order to minimize the travel time. My favorite story of that era was when we went to Maine on a summer holiday. At the border, we were asked if we had any fruit in the car, and Dad informed the guard that we had a bag of oranges that were of Spanish origin. The guard said that they had to be disposed of. But miserly Dad hated the idea of throwing anything away, and so he asked if we could eat them on the spot. The increasingly exasperated border guard said sure, but we would need to turn around and eat them on the Canadian side. For those of you who live in this area, this will all sound very familiar, right? At this point, Mom intervened and yelled, "Ron!" which many of you who know my mother will recognize that, in the way she did when she wanted any of these kinds of behaviors to stop. Despite this, my father was undeterred. He then asked the guard if he would be willing to keep the oranges at the border so that we could pick them up on the return journey. I don't remember the guard's response, but I do remember we somehow magically crossed and we were not detained at the roadside. My father was cheap, but he also liked some of the finer things in life. He loved good tennis rackets, and he always had more tennis rackets than anyone I knew. He loved nice watches, and he liked good food as long as he didn't have to buy it in a restaurant. He had suits made in Hong Kong and shipped to him. He looked good in suits, but once he retired, he swore he was never going to wear them again, and only on special occasions. He worked for trust companies during his long career as a trust officer, but he was not a corporate guy. He told me he couldn't stand to watch the show Mad Men because it reminded him too much of his office days. Nonetheless, he was respected by his colleagues and his clients, and he genuinely liked people, and it showed in his work. We had a couple of times where we spent time together, just he and I. He came to Bosnia with me for my wedding to my wife Branka, who's sitting here, and these were really special times for me. On the trip to Bosnia, he demonstrated his ability to deal with different cultures. One of the moments Branka and I remember best was the meeting of our fathers. Each had been told of what to expect at the moment of greeting. To Dad it was, he will kiss and hug you, go with it. If you know my father, the most he would ever do was shake hands. And to my father-in-law Momo, it was, he will not want to be kissed and hugged. Shake his hand. At the meeting, there was a short hesitation as each sized up the other, and after a short handshake, there was kissing and hugging. My most important memory of my father, and the one that will sustain me through the rest of my days, was that he believed deeply in me as a person. And even though he undoubtedly knew my faults, he never dwelled on those. He made me feel that I could succeed in everything I did. He once told me when I was a very young man that I was a good writer, and he asked me to help him with a letter he needed to write. That request remains one of my most proud moments. To think that my father thought I could write a letter for him, and that he thought I was good enough to do that. I have never forgotten it, and it will always be one of the times I will return to when I doubt myself. I was privileged to spend the last days of his life with him. He was not anxious to leave as he had many good sets left in him. He loved my mother dearly, and their bond will always be a strong one, and one that I wish for in my own marriage. Gradually, however, he realized that his time was coming to an end, and he handled that with the grace and wit that he demonstrated his entire life. I will choose to remember, however, not the last days, but the days where we chatted about world events sitting in our respective chairs, our trip to Bosnia together, our last fishing trip, and the time spent sitting in silence next to each other and feeling the closeness of father and son. So I'd now like to call on my brother John.
I too would like to thank everybody for coming today and welcome you to this celebration of life. I remember the first time that I shook Dad's hand. It was a moment, like Jeff just described, that was a bit of a poignant part of my life, and it was a time when our relationship really crossed a threshold. That relationship with my father and I, with Ron and I, with Dad and I changed over the years. He was the constant in our lives, like Mom remains to be the constant in our lives, and he still is. He was always there our whole lives. I never thought when I was young that I would actually I never tried to understand my father. He just was. He was our normal. He created our normal. He would play catch with us when he was called upon. He was always there for a game of ping pong or a game of tennis. He was there to dispense whisker rubs for us at bedtime every night, sitting on his perch on the sofa, wanting to say goodnight to us. It wasn't until after I crossed that threshold, after I shook hands with my dad, that I ever thought I would try to understand him. I spent years trying to figure it out, and it's been interesting in the last few weeks when people at home have asked me about my father, that it's kind of all come together for me. I think I might have figured him out, but I'm probably wrong. I'm frequently wrong. One of the emotions, one of the thoughts that I've come up with is Dad was actually kind of an ironic person. He was a man who was gifted physically. Jeff described that. He was very talented physically, but he was awkward with physical contact. He was a soft-spoken man who, when he was 50 years old, lost his voice. He was an opinionated guy who was reluctant actually to share his opinion. And he was somebody who felt uncomfortable actually talking very much about what his strongest views were. And ironically, he was a man who died of cancer, the disease that he actually beat for 8 years of his life. I'm going to tell you about that first time I shook hands with my father. It was at the Toronto airport. I was traveling somewhere. Honestly, I can't remember where it was we were traveling. And I got a lift to the airport. Dad always gave us a drive there. He would never let us take the shuttle. He would give us a drive to the airport. Unusually, he didn't just sort of drop me off as a sort of a drive-by in front of the airport. I think he actually paid for parking. He helped me with my luggage, which must have meant I had a lot of it, helped me through the check-in procedure, brought me to the security office, and we were standing there facing each other. And for some reason I felt, obviously a hug, Jeff described this, a hug was not going to happen. And that was mutual. I wasn't a huggy guy either. I've only kind of picked that up later in life. But I felt the need to make some type of contact with Dad. And I remember putting my hand out to shake his hand. And he hesitated. And as I remember it, and it's probably not an accurate memory, but I remember actually physically pulling his hand out of his pocket so that I could shake hands with him. I think he was a little bit shocked at that. And I hope he understood why I needed that. I just needed to have that physical contact. And it was an irony in my mind that a guy who was so confident otherwise with his physical self, that kind of contact was a challenge for him. There were other ironies as well. Dad never did like being loud. He didn't like loud people. But in fact, it was lore in our family, and I don't know if this is true, but it was lore that he actually never spoke until he was 3 years old. And when he did speak, he spoke in full sentences. I think that the thing was, his first sentence was, "Could you please pass the peas?" There's lots of stories, obviously. I don't know if that one's true. But I thought it was fairly ironic that at the age of about 50 years old, he lost his voice entirely. For a guy who actually never used his vocal cords a lot, they kind of either just decided to give up on him, or they certainly didn't wear out. And he had to undergo an operation to put a piece of silicone in to allow him to speak at all. And it was maybe a bit of a waste of time for them to have done that operation for a guy who never used his voice, really. I'm going to tell another story now, one of my memories of times with Dad. Dad, he wasn't a spontaneous guy, and as Jeff said, he didn't like spending money. He was always quoted as saying that the quarter in his pocket he had on a Monday morning would still be there on a Friday afternoon. But Dad and I did a road trip one time, and it was after we had moved to Ontario, not long after we moved to Ontario, and we decided that we would drive together back to Nova Scotia. I didn't know quite why Dad wanted to go to Nova Scotia. He obviously had a plan. I went with him. And there's actually a couple of stories in here. During that trip, we remember we started very early in the morning. We made it through Toronto traffic. We got to Cornwall. We filled up the car with gas, and Dad was hell-bent that we were not going to buy expensive Quebec gasoline. We're driving along the highway. I was kind of dozing in the passenger seat. Dad was driving, and all of a sudden I could feel the car cough and stop, and we coasted to the shoulder. And I said, "What's going on?" And Dad goes, "Well, the car just gave up." And I looked over at the gas meter, it was on empty. And I said, "Well, we run out of gas." And he goes, No, we can't run out of gas because I can drive in this car for days with it on empty. I said, "We're on the highway, we're going 100 kilometers an hour, the car's out of gas." He goes, No, we're not out of gas. So we argued about this for a few minutes on the side of the road, and finally we both get out of the car and we start walking. Quite a friendly traveler actually then picked us up and drove us to the gas station, which Dad thought was totally futile because the car was not out of gas, it was broken. We bought 5 liters of gas. Dad, sort of reluctantly buying 5 liters of gas. We got to lift back to the car, grumbling all the way that, well, we need a tow truck, the car is busted. We put the 5 liters of gas in, and I think what happened was that the mechanic ferries had come and fixed our car on the side of the road while we were getting the gas, because miraculously the car sprung to life when we put the 5 liters in. And then Dad gets behind the wheel and starts driving. And we're getting to the exit where the gas station is, and Dad is making no indication whatsoever of going to the gas station. And I'm saying, "What are you doing?" And he's going, "We got lots of gas to make it to New Brunswick now." So the Brennan gene kicked in and yelled at Dad, "No, we are going on the exit, we are getting gas." And that's what we did. He did pull off and reluctantly fill the car, and we made it all the way, I think probably to Halifax with that tank of gas, that expensive Quebec gas. During that same trip, and this is sort of part of the irony, that was a side story, by the way, that wasn't really the full story. When we were in Nova Scotia, Dad, we were hanging out with our family in Halifax, an area, and he was very keen to go to New Glasgow. New Glasgow was always where he bought his cars. And he was very keen to go. I didn't want to go to New Glasgow. He decided he just one day disappeared one morning and showed up the next day with a new car. So he didn't tell me this. I don't know if he told Mom that he was going to get a new car, but we drove to Nova Scotia in obviously a gas guzzling car and had a much more fuel efficient car to return home in. So it was just the irony that Dad, even though he wouldn't spend $5 on a tank of gas or a little bit of gas, he would spend thousands on a better car. And I'm going to sort of depart a little bit from my script here and talk a little bit about something really important to Dad, and that was pride. And I'm not sure if many of you are aware of this, because he was a quiet-spoken man, but he was an incredibly proud man. And even though, as kids, we didn't talk about our emotions a whole heck of a lot, you didn't have to with Dad. You had a sense of pride with him. You felt it. It was something about being a Wilmshurst, and it's hard to articulate, but it was as if the forces of nature didn't apply to us. It was important in Dad's later life. He talked about the pride when he did. It was about his sons, about me and Jeff and Peter, and about his grandkids, about Mom and her accomplishments, and about his family, his brothers, his father, his mother, so that the past and the future. He didn't talk about pride in his own accomplishments. He didn't talk about spend hours telling us what he had done in his life, but the pride of the people around him. And that was really an important thing to him. In 2006, when we heard that Dad had been diagnosed with colon cancer, we had no idea what the future would hold. We could have guessed. Cancer never, it killed Dad in the end, but he beat it. In all rights, and shortly after he was diagnosed, he could have packed it in and said, that life is done. I'm not going to participate in life anymore, but he didn't. He just kept going. He continued to play tennis throughout all of the cancer treatments that he had and all of the things that cancer did to him. he continued to play bridge, he continued to engage in our lives. And it was as if that pride had kicked into him, as if nature, this was not going to beat him, because he was a Wilmshurst, and the forces of nature didn't apply to him. It was almost as if he shrugged it off. You know, it was willful disregard for what cancer can do to somebody. And you know, and the reality is, I think in that battle, he won. He had 8 strong years. Like all good stories, lives have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And it's the end that's the hard part in any event. Dad's ending was years too soon. He had much left to give. His story wasn't finished. You could, like Jeff, I was there when Dad died, and you could see it in his eyes in his past, his final days, that he was not ready yet. But the irony was that when he was running out of gas in his final days, that was the time when he wanted that physical contact. He wanted to hold my hand when I was in the hospital with him, and by the bed he wanted to be there with Mom and hold Mom and with Jeff, and everybody was around. He wanted that physical contact. I wanted to tell him how much I loved him, and I did. It sounded a bit odd, I have to admit, because we didn't talk about love a lot. We felt it, but he needed to talk about it at that time. Throughout our lives, and Jeff alluded to this, the ball was kind of an intermediary, is how we made contact. I would throw a ball to him, he would throw it back. That ball was the contact between us. And in the final days, the irony was that wasn't good enough for him. He needed that direct contact. I'm going to miss my father. I suspect I'm not alone in that. In fact, I miss him already.
Okay. So my brother Peter is going to come up and say some words. I think he's going to say some words that have been written by
Bruce.
Dad's brother,
Yes,
Bruce.
yes.
And before you do that, you're going to fix this so we can make sure everyone can see you.
Sure, I'll do that. Does this thing hold, or is it there?
This is the beauty of technology, right? I think it's actually still on, but
Well,
just in case.
hi, I'm Peter. I'm Dad's youngest son. I'm going to read a letter to you from his brother Bruce. And so, hold this. So, a letter from Bruce to Ron. At a time like this, one tends to dwell on the highlights, the big events, and accomplishments of one's life. Ron, there were many happy memories we talked about during our Skype chats. My mind's eye captures many such moments. Family get-togethers, camping vacations at Keji, and the canoe trips down the river. There are other events that would remain forgotten unless the memory is given a nudge. One such nudge occurred when I found a ball glove in Mother's basement. The glove, a catcher's mitt, was worse for wear. Without thinking, I put my right hand in a glove made for the left hand, exactly as I had done so 40 years before. When you and your friend hammered me with fastballs, curveballs, or whatever else you could contrive. Fortunately, the neighbor's garage was there to stop the ones that got away. I remember beginning to feel I was ready for the big time after handling such a barrage. Heady stuff for a 12-year-old. The glove's condition left me with the feeling that catching bullets with my teeth would have been a much safer pastime. I was tempted to send you the glove, postage due. We were lucky enough to make several road trips. There were many memories of adventures together, but in particular, I remember an occasion up north when you went to find something for dinner. The sight of you striding back to the car, holding a salmon out in front of you, raising it up so the tail wouldn't drag on the ground, is an image that stayed with me. The grin said you had found the mother lode, although one of frozen gold. Dinner was already late, but now it was time to be very late. I never could get my head around frozen sashimi, or sashimi. I will miss our Skype chats, where we could exchange the highs and lows of our tennis and golf games and discuss the current state of global warming and whatever else was on our minds. Those were great hours together. Although we have lived apart for most of our lives, we were lucky enough to be able to have had many good times together. Bruce, thank you.
Now my son and Ron's grandson, Jake, is going to say some words.
Thanks. Before I go into my prepared speech, John touched on something there for me that really made me think back on something, and that was when you throw the ball back and forth, and it felt like that was a connection. And I know for me and for all the rest of the grandsons that it felt the same way. We used to play catch in the front yard, and I was always insistent that he would throw me fly balls in a tiny front yard, and he would lob them way up in the air, even though we were only about 15 feet apart, and I would slide across, of course, the wet grass here in Langley and get completely soaked. And but he would do it for like an hour, even in his later years when his arm wasn't so strong anymore. And for me, that was always a great experience. And the other thing was he would always let us hit golf balls in his front yard. And but the only thing you weren't allowed to do was pull out anything higher than a 9-iron, because once you got higher than a 9-iron, you would start to be aiming for the windows and the garage doors, and that didn't make him happy, because those were his prize cars back behind those garage doors, and you didn't want to put a golf ball down in the parlor because that wouldn't make Nanny too pleased. So. But for me, almost all of my memories of my grandfather come from that house here in Langley. He loved to be at home dearly, and he loved his couch, his barbecue, his newspaper, and while we did go on some camping trips together, it seemed like everything, when I was thinking of putting this together, came from back there at that house and the memories we had there. And so every summer, I used to go down to my grandparents to help them out around the house, or at least so I would tell myself. The real reason was probably to inhale my grandmother's cooking and watch sports with my grandfather, but I planned on keeping that to myself under a mask of goodwill. I would arrive at the door and I would get a big hug from Nanny, but Grumpy, as we called him, would just wave or shout out hello from the chair, where the comfort of crossword and tennis game remained. Grumpy indeed, I would think to myself, knowing perfectly well that that name had little to do with the demeanor. If that had really been the case, we would have called him thoughtful, or steadfast, or strong. But I doubt any of those monikers would have stuck. One thing we would do every summer was head into the backyard, which was really one of the last vestiges of untrodden forest in the Fraser Valley. It kept a little bit of that unknown and wild spirit in its few acres that too many cities have abandoned these days. We would head onto its overgrown paths and find a tree just fallen, or decades waiting to chop up for the winter's firewood. Grumpy would always tell me that you should always take out the dead ones, the fallen ones first, to avoid unnecessarily cutting down something living that might continue to grow for 50 or 100 or more years than that. And I felt like sometimes to understand a person, that time outside spent working in silence like he loved to do is the best way to understand somebody and how they are. For Grumpy, the little things mattered. The present mattered to him. He wasn't living in the past or for some grand idea of what the future should be. We would stand in front of one tree and he would describe the quality of the wood, how it would burn, how long the tree had been there, the things it must have seen. Then he would start up his chainsaw and go right for the trunk, and the sounds of the real world would drown out the silence of days past. Right through his 70s, he would insist on splitting all the rounds himself. It being the Fraser Valley, the wood was generally always wet, and he would diligently tap a wedge into each piece and drive it right through. It would take him sometimes 5 or 10 minutes, but every single piece he would get right through until he'd split it, and he never gave up on every single one, even though he would take these bits of wood that had been lying there on the ground for 15 years and soaking up the rains of Langley, but he would take every piece out himself, leaving me to transport it by wheelbarrow in and out of the forest, through the mud, seemingly ever present along the tracks of the lower mainland. It never felt like there could be a better place to just think than amongst those damp paths. I understood why Grumpy enjoyed it so much. He liked to contemplate things solitarily, something he has passed on to his sons and his grandchildren. Yet for someone who enjoyed his time alone, he always had patience for us, even if we were a little bit too demanding for his tastes. He would diligently press the gas pedal of the tractor that, as 10-year-old me, would steer it around the house, but I just about tipped that thing over about 1,000 times, but he would steadily steer it through, while I protested that I certainly did not need any help from him, or anybody for that matter. As others have said, and will say, he was never the most talkative person, but when he spoke, you listened. Because if he had something to say, it always mattered. He never wasted his breath. So as we were stacking the wood, he would tell me which pile to put each piece in, wet stuff to the back for the cold winters to come, and dry stuff to the front for immediate use. As many of you will know, even a lukewarm day in Langley would cause him to put on the fire. He never liked to be cold, so the woodshed was always stacked full. And then after we would finish, we would go inside where warmed up leftovers would be waiting. Nanny and Grumpy seemed to move in tandem that way, each's role clearly defined, unspokenly followed. Few things seem more natural to me than the two of them working in the yard, Nanny in the garden, Grumpy in the woods. And that more than anything will be what I will miss. A place to call home, created not by the house or the yard or the forest, but by two people who fit so well together that nothing else felt important.
So I'm going to ask Dad's grandsons, Simon, Severin, and Sebastian, they're going to make a little performance here. I think someone needs to take the mic, right, sir? And I'm going to address this to family who are watching live streaming. So the live streaming is working, I understand, but apparently the microphone is making it hard to hear. So we'll try maybe going forward to do it without the mic, and we'll speak up and hopefully everyone will be able to hear. But they can see us, so hello family. But they're having a little trouble hearing us, but hopefully you'll hear this performance.